Amara Jackson stood in front of the open refrigerator, staring at the empty shelves. Only a half-empty bottle of ketchup and some old butter remained. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's school lunch. At 12 years old, Amara understood her family's problems better than a child should. "Amara, I'm hungry," whined her 7-year-old brother Marcus from the living room, where he was trying to distract himself with a worn-out coloring book. "Me too," echoed 5-year-old Zoe, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Amara closed the refrigerator door and forced a smile. "Mom will be home soon. She's at that job interview, remember? The one she said would fix everything." But Amara knew the truth. Her mother, Denise, had been to 3 interviews this week alone. The factory where she worked for 8 years had closed suddenly, leaving dozens of families in their neighborhood struggling. The little savings they had went to keep their apartment, but that left almost nothing for food. Amara checked her mother's emergency jar on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet. Empty. She had used the last $5 yesterday to buy milk for her siblings. The clock on the wall showed 4:30 p.m. Her mother wouldn't be home for at least 2 more hours. The hungry looks on her siblings' faces made Amara's heart hurt. "I'm going to go out for a little bit," she told Marcus and Zoe. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone except Mom, okay?" Marcus nodded, taking his role as temporary man of the house seriously. Outside, the autumn air felt cool against Amara's face. She walked the 3 blocks to Mr. Kim's corner store, a place where her family had shopped for years. The little bell above the door jingled as she entered. "Hello, Amara," Mr. Kim called from behind the counter. He was an older man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair. "No mom today?" "She's at a job interview," Amara replied, trying to sound casual. "I just came to look around." Mr. Kim nodded and turned his attention to another customer who needed help finding something. Amara wandered through the small store, pretending to browse. Her eyes kept returning to the bread aisle. A simple loaf of bread and some peanut butter would feed her siblings until tomorrow. She had never stolen anything before. Her mother raised her to be honest, to work hard for what she wanted. But what choice did she have now? Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the store could hear it. When Mr. Kim went to the back room and the only other customer was occupied at the far end of the store, Amara quickly slipped a loaf of bread into her backpack. Then, with shaking hands, she added a small jar of peanut butter. The items felt like they weighed 100 pounds inside her bag. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the store's cool air conditioning. She zipped up her backpack and walked toward the exit, pausing to look at some candy as if that had been her purpose all along. "See you later, Mr. Kim," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. Mr. Kim emerged from the back room and waved. Was it her imagination, or did his eyes linger on her backpack for a moment too long? Outside, Amara didn't run. Running would look suspicious, but she walked quickly, her breath coming in short gasps. What had she done? Her mother would be so disappointed. But the thought of her hungry siblings pushed away the guilt. She didn't notice the closed sign Mr. Kim placed on his door. She didn't see him lock up and follow her at a distance. All Amara could think about was getting home and feeding her brother and sister. The weight of the stolen food seemed to grow heavier with each step. Mr. Kim watched Amara leave his store. After 32 years running the corner market, he had developed a special sense about these things. He had seen the way she kept looking around, how her hands trembled slightly, how she avoided eye contact. The security mirror mounted in the corner had shown him everything. The old store owner sighed deeply. He had known the Jackson family for years. Denise Jackson was one of his most loyal customers, always polite, always paid on time when he allowed her to use credit during tight weeks. Her children were well behaved, especially Amara, who always helped her mother carry bags and counted change carefully. "Something is very wrong," Mr. Kim muttered to himself as he quickly grabbed his keys and jacket. He flipped the open sign to closed and locked the door. This was more important than a few more dollars in sales today. He had seen many families struggle in this neighborhood, but the Jacksons had always managed to stay afloat through hard work and dignity. For Amara to steal, this wasn't normal mischief, this was desperation. Mr. Kim kept a reasonable distance as he followed Amara. His old knees protested at the quick pace, but he ignored the pain. The girl walked with her head down, shoulders hunched, stopping occasionally to look around nervously. She clutched her backpack straps tightly, as if afraid the stolen goods might somehow escape. Poor child, he thought. She doesn't even know how to be a proper thief. As he followed her, Mr. Kim noticed how thin Amara looked in her faded jeans and oversized sweater. Had she lost weight recently? He tried to remember when he had last seen Denise in his store. It had been at least 2 weeks. Usually, the family came in every few days for small grocery runs. 2 blocks from his store, Amara stopped suddenly and sat on a bench. Mr. Kim ducked into a doorway and watched as she unzipped her backpack just enough to peek inside, then quickly closed it again. She wiped at her eyes with her sleeve. She was crying. The sight made Mr. Kim's heart ache. In his 68 years of life, he had seen many difficult things. He had come to America after losing everything in his home country. He understood hunger and desperation better than most. When Amara stood up and continued walking, Mr. Kim followed again. He wasn't angry about the stolen bread and peanut butter. He was worried about what had driven this good girl to steal. As they entered the apartment complex where the Jacksons lived, Mr. Kim spotted Mrs. Garcia, the building manager, sweeping the front steps. "Afternoon, Mrs. Garcia," he called, approaching her as Amara disappeared inside. "Mr. Kim, what brings you to this side of the neighborhood?" Mrs. Garcia asked, leaning on her broom. "I'm concerned about the Jackson family," he said. "The mother and 3 children in 3B. Have you seen them lately?" Mrs. Garcia's face grew serious. It's been rough for them. The factory where Denise worked closed down without warning. Many families here were affected, but Denise has 3 kids to feed on her own. "No assistance?" Mr. Kim asked. "She applied for everything, but you know how slow the system works, and she's too proud to ask for help. She keeps saying she just needs to find a new job and everything will be fine, but I've seen her leaving for interviews every day for weeks now. Nothing yet." Mr. Kim nodded, understanding completely. He remembered his own pride when he first came to this country, how hard it had been to accept help. "The children," he said quietly. "Are they okay?" Mrs. Garcia shook her head slightly. "The little ones don't understand why there's no food sometimes. Amara tries to be strong for her mother, but she's just a child herself." As Mr. Kim walked back toward his store, his mind was made up. He wasn't going to call the police or confront Amara about the theft. He had a different plan forming, one that would help the family without hurting their pride. He remembered what his own father had taught him long ago. Sometimes people don't need punishment. They need understanding. Amara rushed up the stairs to the 3rd floor of their apartment building, her backpack bouncing against her back with each step. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her shoulders more heavily than the stolen food. She had never broken the law before. Her mother had always taught her that their dignity was something no one could take away, but here she was, giving it up for a loaf of bread and some peanut butter. When she reached their apartment door, she knocked 3 times, then 2 more, their special code so her siblings would know it was safe to open up. "Did you bring food?" Marcus asked immediately, his eyes wide with hope as he pulled the door open. Amara nodded, unable to meet his innocent gaze. "Let me in quick," she whispered, looking over her shoulder nervously. The hallway was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Inside the small apartment, Zoe sat on the worn couch, her stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly to her chest. The TV was off to save electricity. A few broken crayons and papers were scattered on the floor, the only entertainment they could afford. "I'm making sandwiches," Amara announced, trying to sound normal as she headed to the kitchen area. Her hands still trembled as she pulled out the bread and peanut butter. "Where did you get that?" Marcus asked, following her. At 7, he was already too observant for his own good. "Don't worry about it," Amara replied, her voice sharper than she intended. Seeing her brother's hurt expression, she softened. "I'm sorry, I just found a way to get it. That's all you need to know." As the children ate their sandwiches, Amara couldn't enjoy her food. Each bite felt like a confession of guilt. She kept thinking about Mr. Kim. Had he seen her? Would he call the police? Would her mother come home to find officers waiting to take her daughter away? "I need to go out again," she told her siblings after they had eaten. "Just for a little while." But Mom said to stay inside. Marcus protested. "I know, but I need to check something. Lock the door behind me. I won't be long." Outside the apartment building, Amara paced nervously. She needed to know if Mr. Kim had seen her. Maybe she could go back and confess, offer to work to pay for what she took. Her mother would be furious and disappointed, but it would be better than waiting for the police to show up. As she walked down the street toward the store, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Every passing car made her jump. Was that a police cruiser? Would they recognize her from security cameras? Halfway to the store, Amara stopped suddenly. Mr. Kim's Market had a sign in the window. CLOSD. This was strange. The store never closed this early on weekdays. Had he gone to report her to the police? Panic rose in her chest. She turned quickly, planning to run back home, when she spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench in the small park across the street. It was Mr. Kim, and he seemed to be watching her. Their eyes met across the distance. Amara froze, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Mr. Kim stood up slowly and raised his hand in a small wave. He didn't look angry. In fact, if Amara had to describe his expression, she would say he looked sad. Should she approach him? Apologize? Run? Her mind raced through the options, none of them good. Before she could decide, Mr. Kim began walking toward her with unhurried steps. Amara's breathing quickened. There was nowhere to hide now. The moment of truth had arrived. Amara, he called softly when he was close enough. May I speak with you for a moment? His voice wasn't harsh or accusatory. It held the same gentle tone he always used when speaking to customers in his store. Still, Amara couldn't stop the tears that sprang to her eyes. I'm sorry, she blurted out before he could say anything else. I've never stolen anything before. I was just so hungry, and my brother and sister. Mr. Kim held up his hand, stopping her flow of words. Let's sit down, he said, gesturing to a nearby bench. I think we need to talk about what happened today, but not like this. Not with you standing there looking like you expect me to call the police any minute. Amara swallowed hard. Whoever came next would change everything. As she followed Mr. Kim to the bench, she wondered what her mother would say when she found out what her daughter had done. Mr. Kim sat on the bench and patted the space next to him. Amara hesitated before slowly sitting down, keeping as much distance between them as the small bench allowed. Her body remained tense, ready to run if needed. I have known your family for many years, Mr. Kim began, his accent more pronounced when he spoke slowly. Your mother is a good woman. Honest. Hardworking. Amara looked down at her worn sneakers. The mention of her mother made the shame burn hotter inside her chest. She would be very sad to know what happened today, yes? Mr. Kim asked. Amara nodded, unable to speak as tears threatened to spill over. A heavy silence hummed between them for several moments. Why did you not ask for help, Amara? Mr. Kim finally asked. His voice wasn't angry or accusing. It sounded genuinely confused. Mom says we don't take handouts, Amara whispered. She says we work for what we need. And your mother, she is working now? She's trying, Amara said, finally looking up at Mr. Kim. She goes to interviews every day, but nobody is hiring. The factory closed and everyone is looking for jobs. She says something will come through soon, but her voice trailed off. Mr. Kim nodded thoughtfully. And how long has your family been without enough food? The direct question made Amara uncomfortable. Admitting their poverty felt like betraying her mother's pride. But Mr. Kim's kind eyes held no judgment, only concern. Almost 3 weeks, she admitted. Mom gets some help with food stamps, but it's not enough. She keeps giving her portion to us kids. Sometimes she doesn't eat all day. Mr. Kim's weathered face showed a flash of pain at this revelation. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to Amara, who realized tears were now streaming down her face. I didn't want to steal, she said, wiping her cheeks with the handkerchief. I just couldn't listen to my brother and sister crying from hunger anymore. I understand more than you know, Mr. Kim said softly. When I came to this country, I had nothing. Less than nothing. I had debts to people who helped me escape my homeland during the war. Amara looked at him with surprise. Mr. Kim never talked about his past. He was just the store owner who had always been there, as permanent as the street signs. My first winter here, I had no warm clothes, very little food, he continued. One day, I was so cold and hungry that I stole an apple from a fruit stand. The owner caught me. What happened? Amara asked, momentarily forgetting her own troubles. A small smile appeared on Mr. Kim's face. That man became my first friend in America. Instead of calling police, he offered me job sweeping his store. He said everyone deserves second chance, especially those who steal only when desperate. Mr. Kim reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small paper bag. He handed it to Amara. Inside were 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a small carton of milk. For your brother and sister, he said. And there is extra sandwich for your mother when she returns. Amara stared at the bag, then at Mr. Kim. I don't understand. Aren't you mad about what I took? The bread and peanut butter? Those things are not important. What is important is that a good girl like you felt she had no choice but to become a thief. This is what makes me sad. Mr. Kim stood up slowly, his knees cracking with the effort. Tomorrow, I would like to speak with your mother. Not to tell her what you did, he added quickly when he saw panic flash across Amara's face, but to offer something that might help your family. What kind of something? Amara asked suspiciously. A job. And maybe a new way for people in this neighborhood to help each other without anyone losing their dignity. Mr. Kim smiled. Will you ask your mother to come see me tomorrow? Amara nodded, clutching the paper bag of food. As Mr. Kim turned to leave, she called after him. Mr. Kim, I'm really sorry about taking the food. The old man looked back at her. Sometimes, Amara, the mistakes we make lead us to exactly where we need to be. Denise Jackson returned home at 7:30 that evening, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Another interview, another polite rejection. We'll call you if something opens up had become the soundtrack of her life. She unlocked the door to find her 3 children sitting quietly at their small kitchen table, an unusual scene that immediately put her on alert. What's wrong? She asked, setting down her purse and the folder containing her increasingly worn resume. Nothing, Mama, Amara said quickly, too quickly. Denise looked at her oldest daughter carefully. Amara's eyes were slightly red, as if she'd been crying. Marcus and Zoe were unusually quiet, watching the interaction between their mother and sister with wide eyes. You all ate? Denise asked, noticing the empty plates on the table. We had sandwiches, Marcus volunteered cheerfully. Peanut butter. And milk too. Denise frowned slightly. Peanut butter? Milk? Where did those come from? The refrigerator had been nearly empty when she left that morning, and she knew there was no money left until her unemployment check arrived next week. Amara stood up, wringing her hands. Mom, I need to tell you something. Denise's heart sank. She recognized that tone. It was the same one Amara had used when she broke Grandma's vase last year, but this seemed more serious. There's a sandwich for you too. Zoe piped up, pointing to the paper bag on the counter, unaware of the tension building in the room. Amara, what's going on? Denise asked, her voice firm but gentle. Tell me the truth. Amara took a deep breath. Mr. Kim wants to talk to you tomorrow. He says it's important. Mr. Kim? From the corner store? What does he want with me? Amara's eyes filled with tears. I did something bad, Mom. I was so hungry, and Marcus and Zoe kept crying, and you weren't home yet, and... She stole food from Mr. Kim's store, Marcus blurted out, then immediately covered his mouth with his hands, eyes wide with regret at his outburst. The room fell silent. Denise stared at her daughter, disbelief and disappointment washing over her face. You did what? Amara couldn't hold back her tears now. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know what else to do. We were so hungry, and I just thought. Denise closed her eyes briefly, trying to process this information. All her life, she had taught her children that integrity mattered more than anything else. That even when you had nothing, you still had your good name, your honesty. And now, hunger had pushed her daughter to cross a line she had never thought Amara would cross. Did he catch you? Denise asked quietly. Amara nodded miserably. He followed me home, but he wasn't mad, Mom. He was... kind. He gave us more food and said he wants to talk to you tomorrow about a job. A job. Denise repeated, confusion replacing some of her disappointment. That's what he said. He wants you to come to the store tomorrow morning. Denise sat down heavily at the table, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The weight of the past weeks, the constant job rejections, the worried looks from her children, the growing stack of bills pressed down on her. And now this. Mom, are you going to punish Amara? Zhu asked in a small voice. Denise looked at her oldest child, tears streaming down her face. The girl who had always been so responsible, so helpful. The girl who had practically become a second mother to her siblings since their father left 3 years ago. We'll talk about that later, Denise said finally. Right now, I need to understand what Mr. Kim is offering, because if it's charity, we don't need it. We'll figure something out. It's not charity, Amara insisted. He said it's a job, and something about helping people without hurting their dignity. Denise sighed and reached for the sandwich in the paper bag. Her pride wanted to refuse it, but her empty stomach overruled her pride. As she took a bite, she made a decision. Tomorrow morning, we'll go see Mr. Kim together. You'll apologize properly, and we'll hear what he has to say. Her voice softened as she looked at her daughter's tear-stained face. Amara, what you did was wrong, but I understand why you did it. I'm sorry I put you in that position. Amara's eyes widened in surprise. You're not mad? I'm disappointed, Denise corrected. But I'm more disappointed in myself for not finding a way to feed my children. She reached across the table and took Amara's hand. We'll face this together, okay, like we do everything else. The next morning, Denise and Amara walked to Mr. Kim's store together. Denise had dropped the younger children at a neighbor's apartment. She wore her interview clothes, a simple navy blouse and black pants that she had ironed carefully the night before. Amara walked beside her mother, stomach tight with anxiety. Remember, Denise said quietly as they approached the store, you will apologize sincerely, then you will listen. No excuses. Yes, ma'am, Amara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. The closed sign still hung on the door, but when Mr. Kim spotted them through the window, he hurried over to unlock it. The little bell jingled as they entered. Mrs. Jackson, thank you for coming, Mr. Kim said, his face breaking into a warm smile. And Amara too. Please, come to the back room. I have made tea. Denise's posture remained stiff as she followed him. She had spent all night rehearsing what she would say, how she would make this right. The back room surprised Amara. Instead of a storage area full of boxes, it was a small, tidy office with a round table and 4 chairs. A hot teapot sat on the table alongside 3 cups and a plate of cookies. Please, sit, Mr. Kim gestured. Tea is good for difficult conversations. Once they were seated, Amara couldn't wait any longer. Mr. Kim, I'm so sorry for stealing from your store. It was wrong, and I'll never do it again. I'll work to pay back what I took. Mr. Kim nodded, accepting her apology with a gentle smile. Thank you, Amara. I believe you are sorry, and I forgive you. Denise cleared her throat. Mr. Kim, I want to apologize as well. I raised my children better than this. What Amara did reflects on my failure as a parent. I'll make sure she works to repay you, and I'll pay for the items she took as soon as I can. Mrs. Jackson, Mr. Kim said, pouring tea into each cup. There is no failure here, only hard times. He pushed a cup toward each of them, then continued. Many years ago, when I first came to this country, I had nothing. My family died in the war. I came here alone, with no English, no money, no friends. Denise listened politely, though her mind was on how she would pay for the stolen items. One very cold day, Mr. Kim continued. I stole an apple from a fruit stand. I was so hungry. The owner caught me. He smiled at the memory. His name was Mr. Abramowitz. Instead of calling police, he asked me why I stole. Mr. Kim took a sip of his tea before continuing. When I told him I had no food, no job, he gave me a job sweeping his store. Later, he helped me learn English. He helped me save money to open my own small store. His eyes grew misty. He changed my life with his kindness. Amara listened, fascinated. She had never imagined Mr. Kim as a young man, struggling and scared. Mrs. Jackson, I know the factory closed. Many of my customers work there. I know times are very hard for many families right now. Denise stiffened. We don't need charity, Mr. Kim. We'll get by. Not charity, Mr. Kim shook his head firmly. I need help in my store. Morning hours, when I do inventory and receive deliveries. The pay is not much, but it is honest work. Denise's expression changed slightly. You're offering me a job? Yes, and something more. Mr. Kim leaned forward. I want to start what Mr. Abramowitz taught me. A community program. People who can afford it pay a little extra when they shop. This money helps families who are struggling right now. Like a food bank? Denise asked skeptically. No, no, more dignified. Families who need help can shop normally. They pay what they can. The community fund covers the rest. He looked directly at Denise. No one knows who needs help except me. Amara watched her mother's face, seeing the battle between pride and need. And Mr. Kim added gently, when things are better, you can help the next family who struggles. This is how community works. A tear slipped down Denise's cheek. For weeks, she had carried the weight of her family's hunger alone, too proud to ask for help, too afraid to admit she was failing. The job, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tear. When would I start? The following Monday morning, Denise Jackson arrived at Mr. Kim's store at 6:30 a.m. sharp. The streets were still quiet, with only a few early workers hurrying to catch buses. She wore simple clothes, jeans, and a clean t-shirt, with her hair pulled back neatly. Though she had barely slept the night before, worrying about this new arrangement, her steps were determined. Mr. Kim was already there, unlocking the store's back entrance. He smiled when he saw her. Good morning, Mrs. Jackson. Ready for your first day? Yes, sir, she replied, straightening her shoulders. And please call me Denise. Inside, Mr. Kim showed her around the stockroom. Boxes of products were stacked neatly against the walls. A clipboard hung by the door with inventory sheets. First, we checked deliveries against orders. Mr. Kim explained, showing her the system he had used for decades. Then we stocked shelves before opening at 8 o'clock. Denise listened carefully, taking mental notes. She had worked in inventory at the factory for years. This wasn't so different. What about this community program you mentioned? She asked as they unpacked a box of canned vegetables. Mr. Kim reached under the counter and pulled out a small wooden box with a slot on top. Hand-painted on the side were the words neighbor to neighbor. This will sit by register, he explained. I tell customers they can round up their purchase to next dollar if they wish. Some give more. Money goes in box. And then? Denise asked. Then, when families need help, they can shop with dignity. No one knows who pays full price and who doesn't. Mr. Kim's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Only rule is, when someone is back on feet, they help next person in need. Denise thought about this. It wasn't charity exactly. It was neighbors helping neighbors through tough times. Something about that felt different, more acceptable to her pride. By 8 o'clock a.m., they had stocked the shelves and prepared the store for opening. As Mr. Kim turned the sign from closed to open, he handed Dennis a small notebook. For families who need help, he explained. You write their names, no questions asked. Just bring me the list each week. Denise stared at the notebook. You trust me to decide who needs help. You know who is struggling, Mr. Kim said simply. Better than me. Throughout that first day, as Denise learned the cash register and helped customers find items, she watched Mr. Kim introduce the wooden box to each person who came in. Most nodded and added their spare change. Some added dollar bills. A few asked questions, but no one refused. During her lunch break, Denise sat in the back room, thinking about the families in her building who had also lost jobs at the factory. Mrs. Rodriguez with her 4 children, the elderly Williams couple who lived on a fixed income. Slowly, she opened the notebook and began to write. That evening, when Denise came home, her children noticed the difference immediately. There was a lightness to her step that had been missing for weeks. How was work, Mom? Amara asked, helping her mother with the grocery bag she carried. It was good, Denise replied, unpacking bread, eggs, milk, and vegetables on the counter. Really good. Marcus peeked into the bag. We can eat all this? Yes, baby, we can eat all this. Denise smiled, ruffling his hair. And Mr. Kim is giving Amara a job too. After school, 2 days a week. Amara looked up in surprise. Me? But after what I did? Mr. Kim says that's exactly why. You know the importance of second chances now. Denise pulled her daughter into a hug. He wants you to help with the community program, keeping track of the donations, maybe making flyers. That night, for the first time in weeks, the Jackson family ate a full meal together. As Denise watched her children eat, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Later, when the younger children were asleep, Amara helped her mother wash the dishes. "Mom," she said quietly, "are we going to be okay now?" Denise looked at her daughter, so young and yet carrying so many adult worries. "Yes, baby, we're going to be okay. Not because someone saved us, but because our community is looking out for each other. And someday soon, we'll be the ones helping someone else." 6 months had passed since that desperate day when Amara stole food from Mr. Kim's store. The neighborhood had changed in small but important ways, and the Jackson family had changed most of all. On a bright Saturday morning, Amara stood behind the counter at Kim's Corner Market, carefully counting change for an elderly customer. At 14, she had grown taller in the past months, but the biggest change was in her confidence. "Thank you for shopping with us, Mrs. Wilson," Amara said with a smile. "Would you like to round up to the next dollar for our Neighbor to Neighbor Fund today?" "Of course, dear," Mrs. Wilson replied, dropping her coins into the wooden box that now sat prominently by the register. The box had been repainted by the children at the community center, decorated with colorful handprints and the words "Today Me, Tomorrow You" written across the top. What had started as Mr. Kim's simple idea had grown into something the whole neighborhood took pride in. A bulletin board near the entrance displayed job listings, childcare offers, and other community resources. People came to the store not just for groceries but for connection. "Good job with the inventory yesterday," Mr. Kim said, appearing from the stockroom. "You have good head for numbers." Amara beamed at the praise. Her weekend job at the store had taught her more than just how to work a cash register. Mr. Kim showed her how to track inventory, calculate profits, and manage the store's simple accounting. She was saving her earnings for college now, a dream that had seemed impossible just months ago. The bell above the door jingled, and Denise walked in wearing the assistant manager vest Mr. Kim had given her last month when he promoted her. She had just returned from the bank, making the store's weekly deposit. "Busy morning?" she asked, noticing the line of customers. "Steady," Mr. Kim nodded, looking pleased. Business had increased since they started the community program. People liked shopping at a store that cared about its neighbors. During a quiet moment, Amara watched her mother chatting easily with customers. The worry lines that had once seemed permanently etched on Denise's face had softened. She laughed more these days. Last week, she had even started taking online classes to finish her business degree, with Mr. Kim's encouragement. At noon, Marcus and Zoe burst into the store, back from their morning at the community center where volunteers helped kids with homework on Saturdays. "Mom, I got an A on my math test," Marcus announced proudly, waving a paper with a red mark on top. "That's wonderful, honey," Denise said, giving him a quick hug before turning back to her customer. Zoe tugged on Amara's sleeve. "Can I help put price tags on stuff again?" "After lunch," Amara promised. Mr. Kim brought sandwiches for everyone today. The family ate together in the back room, joined by Mr. Kim and two new employees, both former factory workers who had struggled to find jobs. "I have news," Denise announced as they ate. "The Neighbor to Neighbor program is getting attention. The newspaper wants to do a story about it next week." Mr. Kim looked embarrassed. "Not necessary. We're just doing what neighbors should do." "That's exactly why they want to write about it," Denise insisted. "Other neighborhoods could use programs like this." After lunch, as Amara helped restock shelves, she noticed a young mother with two small children enter the store. The woman looked around nervously, clutching her purse tightly. Amara recognized that look, a mixture of hunger, pride, and desperation. She had worn it herself not so long ago. Quietly, Amara approached the woman. "Welcome to Kim's," she said warmly. "First time shopping with us?" The woman nodded, her eyes downcast. "Let me tell you about our store," Amara continued gently. "We have a special program here. It's called Neighbor to Neighbor." As Amara explained how the program worked, she saw relief wash over the woman's face, the same relief she had felt when Mr. Kim had shown kindness instead of judgment. Later, as the sun began to set and they prepared to close the store, Amara stood outside with Mr. Kim, watching children play in the small park across the street. "Mr. Kim," she said thoughtfully, "that day when you caught me stealing, you could have called the police." "What good would that do?" he replied simply. "Hungry child needs food, not punishment." "You changed our lives," Amara said softly. Mr. Kim smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. No, Amara, you changed your lives. I just opened door, you walked through it. As they turned to go back inside, Amara realized something important. What had begun as her worst moment had somehow become the catalyst for her family's new beginning. One small act of desperation, met with understanding instead of anger, had transformed not just her family, but an entire community.